The storm had followed them up the mountain, rain hammering on the windshield, lightning tearing across the sky. The old couple didn't speak. They hadn't spoken much since their children stopped visiting, stopped calling, stopped caring. All they had left was an address scribbled on an old paper deed, Cabin 12, Redwood Valley. When they arrived, the place looked dead. Shattered windows, vines crawling through the floorboards, dust thick as grief. But as the old man opened the door, something flickered in his wife's eyes. Not fear, not sadness, but a spark of memory. "This was where we first met," she whispered. They didn't plan to stay long. But then strange things began to happen. The garden that had been dry for decades suddenly bloomed. A spring of water ran beneath the house, and every morning, 2 deer appeared at the door as if guarding them. It was as if the mountain itself refused to let them go. What started as a place of sorrow slowly became something sacred, a paradise born from abandonment, a miracle hidden in the mist. Stay with me until the end, because what they discovered up there will leave you with chills and tears all at once. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. Harold and Margaret Whitmore had spent 46 years building a life that looked perfect from the outside. 3 children raised in a comfortable suburban home with a manicured lawn and holiday cards that always arrived on time. Harold worked as an accountant, steady and reliable, while Margaret volunteered at the hospital and kept photo albums filled with smiling faces at birthday parties and graduations. Their children grew up with every advantage: college funds and family vacations, support through difficult times, and celebrations during achievements. But somewhere along the way, the warmth faded. Phone calls became shorter, visits more infrequent. Their eldest daughter moved across the country for a job promotion and rarely made time to fly back. Their son became consumed with his own family, always too busy with soccer games and school events to visit. Their youngest stopped answering texts altogether, disappearing into a life that no longer seemed to include the people who raised her. Harold and Margaret told themselves it was normal. Children grow up and build their own lives. That's what parents want: independence and success. But when Harold fell ill with pneumonia last winter and spent a week in the hospital, none of their children came. Excuses arrived through text messages. Work deadlines, sick kids, car troubles. Margaret sat beside his hospital bed every night, holding his hand in the fluorescent silence, wondering when they had become so easy to abandon. After Harold recovered, something shifted between them. A quiet resignation settled into their daily routines. They stopped expecting birthday calls. They stopped leaving voicemails that went unreturned. They stopped pretending that everything was fine. The house felt too large, too empty, filled with memories that had nowhere to go. Then one afternoon, while sorting through boxes in the attic, Margaret found an old wooden chest she hadn't opened in decades. Inside were photographs from their youth, back when they had nothing but each other and a dream of building something meaningful together. There were letters tied with faded ribbon, ticket stubs from concerts and train rides, and at the very bottom, a property deed for a cabin in Redwood Valley. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the paper. She remembered that cabin. It belonged to Harold's grandfather, a quiet place tucked away in the mountains where they had spent one perfect summer when they were young and in love. She remembered mornings filled with birdsong, evenings by the fire, the way Harold had looked at her under the stars and promised they would always take care of each other. When she showed Harold the deed that evening, his eyes clouded with recognition. He hadn't thought about that cabin in years. His grandfather had passed away long ago, and the property had been forgotten, lost in the shuffle of life's obligations and responsibilities. But holding that piece of paper now felt like finding a message from another lifetime. "Maybe we should go see it," Margaret suggested quietly. "Just to look, just to remember." Harold studied her face, seeing something there he hadn't seen in months. A flicker of hope, perhaps, or curiosity, Or maybe just a desire to feel something other than the hollow ache of being forgotten by the people they loved most. They packed light. 2 suitcases, some basic supplies. No clear plan beyond driving up the mountain to see what remained of a place that once meant everything. They told no one they were leaving. There was no one to tell. The drive took most of the day, winding roads climbing higher and higher until the air grew thin and cool. The landscape transformed around them. Suburban sprawl gave way to dense forest, towering pines and thick underbrush that seemed to swallow the world whole. The GPS lost signal miles back, and they navigated by memory and guesswork, following old landmarks that Harold barely recognized. When the storm rolled in, it came fast and furious. Dark clouds swallowed the sky, and rain began to fall in sheets that turned the dirt road into a river of mud. Thunder cracked overhead, and lightning illuminated the forest in brief, blinding flashes. Margaret gripped the door handle, her knuckles white, while Harold leaned forward, squinting through the windshield as the wipers struggled to keep pace. Then, through the rain and mist, they saw it. A wooden structure barely visible through the trees, sagging and weathered, more ruin than refuge. Harold pulled the car as close as he could, and they sat for a moment in stunned silence, staring at what remained of the cabin they remembered. "This can't be it," Margaret whispered. But it was. The porch had collapsed on one side, the roof sagged in the middle, and vines had claimed the walls. Winding through broken windows and curling around doorframes, the forest had tried to reclaim the structure, and it had nearly succeeded. Harold turned off the engine. The rain pounded against the roof, a relentless drumbeat that matched the sinking feeling in his chest. They had come all this way for nothing. There was no refuge here, no escape, just another reminder of things lost and time wasted. But Margaret opened her door. Harold reached for her arm. "Margaret, wait. It's not safe." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I need to see inside." He wanted to argue, to convince her to turn around and drive back down the mountain before the storm made the roads impassable. But something in her voice stopped him, a determination he hadn't heard in years. So he grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and followed her into the rain. The porch groaned under their weight, wood soft with rot and decades of neglect. Margaret pushed open the front door, which hung crooked on its hinges, and stepped inside. Harold followed, sweeping the flashlight across the interior. Dust covered every surface, thick and undisturbed. Furniture sat where it had been left. A table with one broken leg, chairs tipped over, a stone fireplace blackened with old soot. The floorboards were warped and split in places, and the smell of mildew hung heavy in the air. It looked like a place where time had stopped, where life had simply walked away and never looked back. Margaret moved through the main room slowly, her fingers trailing along the dusty surfaces. She stopped in front of the fireplace, staring at the stones as if reading a story written there. "We sat right here," she said softly, "that first night. You tried to start a fire and almost burned the place down." Harold remembered. He had been so nervous, so eager to impress her. They had laughed until their sides hurt, and later, when the fire finally caught, they had sat together in its warmth and talked about the future they wanted to build. Margaret turned to face him, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain that still dripped from her hair. "This place is falling apart," she said, "just like us." Harold set the flashlight on the table and crossed the room to her. He took her hands in his, feeling how cold they were, how fragile. "We're not falling apart," he said quietly. "We're still here. But for how long, Harold? How long before we just fade away? Forgotten like this cabin?" He didn't have an answer. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of rain drumming on the broken roof and wind whistling through the gaps in the walls. Then, through the storm, they heard it. A soft rustling outside, followed by a gentle thud against the door. Harold grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the entrance, Margaret close behind him. He opened the door slowly, expecting to find a branch blown loose by the wind. Instead, 2 deer stood on the porch, A buck and a doe, their coats slick with rain, their dark eyes calm and unafraid. They stared at Harold and Margaret for a long moment, then turned and walked away into the forest, disappearing into the mist. Margaret's breath caught. "Did you see that?" Harold nodded, unable to speak. There was something about the way those animals had looked at them, something almost knowing, as if they had been waiting. They stood in the doorway, watching the storm rage around them, and for the first time since arriving, Harold felt something shift. Not hope exactly, but possibility. A sense that maybe, just maybe, this forgotten place still had something to offer. "Let's stay tonight," Margaret said suddenly. "Just one night, to see what the morning brings." Harold looked at her, saw the determination in her eyes, and found himself nodding. They had nowhere else to be, no one waiting for them, no obligations pulling them back down the mountain. For once in their lives, they were free to choose where they belonged. They worked together to clear a space in the main room, sweeping away debris and setting up sleeping bags they had packed in the car. The storm continued outside, but inside, they created a small pocket of order in the chaos. Harold managed to start a fire in the old fireplace, and the flames cast dancing shadows across the walls. As they sat together by the fire that night, listening to the rain and watching the embers glow, something unspoken passed between them. A shared understanding that they had reached a turning point. They could return to their empty house and wait for their children to remember them, or they could stay here and remember themselves. Margaret leaned against Harold's shoulder. "Tomorrow we start fixing this place," she said quietly. "If it will have us." Harold kissed the top of her head. "Then we make it ours." Neither of them slept much that night. The storm raged on, and the cabin creaked and groaned around them. But when the first light of dawn finally broke through the clouds, something extraordinary happened. The light came slowly, filtering through gaps in the damaged roof where shingles had long since blown away. Harold woke first, his back aching from sleeping on the hard floor despite the sleeping bag's thin padding. He lay still for a moment, listening to Margaret's steady breathing beside him, and wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. But then he heard something that made him sit up. Water. The unmistakable sound of running water somewhere beneath the floorboards. He reached for his flashlight and carefully stood, his joints protesting the movement. The sound grew louder as he moved toward the back corner of the cabin, where the floor sagged noticeably. Margaret stirred behind him. "What is it?" Harold knelt down, pressing his ear against the warped boards. "There's water running under here. A lot of it." They spent the next hour carefully prying up loose floorboards, revealing a sight that defied explanation. Clear water flowed through a natural channel in the bedrock beneath the cabin, creating a small underground stream that sparkled in the morning light. The water was cold and pristine, tasting of minerals and mountain stone when Harold cupped his hand to sample it. "This wasn't here before," Margaret said, her voice filled with wonder. "Your grandfather never mentioned anything about a spring." Harold shook his head slowly. The cabin had been built directly over a water source, yet somehow this stream had remained hidden for decades, or perhaps it had only recently emerged, carved by time and pressure into existence. Either way, it changed everything. With water this clean and constant, they could actually live here, not just survive, but truly make a home. Margaret knelt beside the stream, letting her fingers trail through the current. Her eyes held that spark again, the one Harold had glimpsed the night before. "We could repair the floor around it," she said. "Make it a feature instead of hiding it." Harold found himself smiling. His practical accountant's mind was already calculating what they would need: tools, materials, time. But underneath those calculations ran something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. They spent that first full day exploring the property, discovering what remained and what had been lost. The cabin itself was roughly 20 feet square, with a small loft space accessible by a ladder that had rotted through. The stone fireplace and chimney stood solid, built by craftsmen who understood their work would need to last. The walls were thick logs, hand-hewn and fitted, still structurally sound despite the cosmetic damage. Behind the cabin, they found the remains of a garden plot, now overgrown with wild grasses and weeds. Margaret knelt there, pulling away layers of dead vegetation until she uncovered dark, rich soil beneath. She pressed her fingers into the earth, feeling its texture, and something in her expression softened. "This ground remembers," she said quietly. "Look how dark it is, how soft. Plants grew here once. They could grow again." Harold watched his wife work, saw how the morning light caught the silver in her hair, and realized he was seeing her truly for the first time in months. Not as someone defeated by their children's abandonment, but as someone rediscovering herself in the simplest acts. Touching soil, feeling water, breathing mountain air. They walked the perimeter of the property, finding old boundary markers carved into trees. The land encompassed nearly 5 acres, most of it dense forest that climbed the mountainside behind them. A narrow creek ran along the eastern edge, fed by snowmelt from higher elevations. Wildflowers grew in scattered patches where sunlight penetrated the canopy, their colors vivid against the green. And everywhere they looked, signs of wildlife. Deer tracks pressed into the mud near the creek, the territorial scratching of bears on tree trunks, bird nests tucked into high branches. The mountain was alive in ways their suburban neighborhood had never been, pulsing with rhythms older than human memory. By afternoon, they had compiled a mental list of everything that needed attention. The roof required extensive repairs. Windows needed replacing. The porch had to be rebuilt. Interior walls needed patching. The list grew longer with each passing hour, and the scope of work seemed overwhelming. But Harold felt energized rather than discouraged. For the first time since his hospital stay, he felt useful. His hands itched to hold tools again, to build something that mattered. Margaret found an old notebook in one of the kitchen drawers, its pages yellowed but still usable. She sat at the broken table and began making lists. Seeds they would need for the garden, supplies for cleaning and repairs, food staples to stock the pantry. Her handwriting filled page after page, neat and purposeful. That evening, as they prepared a simple meal over the fireplace, Harold voiced the question that had been building all day. "Should we tell the children where we are?" Margaret paused, a can of soup halfway to the pot. "Do you think they would care?" The question hung between them, sharp and honest. Harold wanted to say yes, wanted to believe their children would worry, would come looking, would feel some measure of concern for their parents' well-being. But he couldn't quite convince himself. "Let's wait," Margaret said finally. "Let's see if anyone notices we're gone first." They ate in silence, watching the fire dance. Outside, darkness settled over the mountain, deep and complete in ways that city darkness never was. No streetlights, no passing cars, no ambient glow from neighboring houses. Just stars appearing one by one in the vast sky above. So many that Harold lost count. After dinner, they heard movement outside. Harold grabbed his flashlight and opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find a bear or mountain lion. Instead, the same 2 deer from the previous night stood at the edge of the clearing. The buck's antlers caught the flashlight beam, reflecting it back in points of brilliance. "They're back," Margaret whispered, moving to stand beside Harold. The deer showed no fear. They simply stood there, watching, as if keeping vigil. Then, as silently as they had appeared, they melted back into the forest. Margaret gripped Harold's arm. "This place wants us here. I know that sounds crazy, but I feel it." Harold didn't argue. He felt it too. Something about this mountain, this forgotten cabin, this unexpected spring of water. It all seemed too perfectly timed to be mere coincidence. That night, they slept more soundly than they had in months. No anxiety about unanswered phone calls. No wondering if today would be the day their children finally reached out. Just the simple exhaustion of physical work and the deep quiet of the mountain night. Morning brought their first real challenge. Harold woke to find Margaret already up, standing in the doorway with a troubled expression. He joined her, following her gaze to the sky. Dark clouds massed on the horizon, moving toward them with visible speed. "Another storm's coming," she said. "A big one by the looks of it." They spent the morning securing what they could. Harold climbed carefully onto the damaged roof and spread a tarp over the worst gaps, weighing it down with rocks. Margaret moved their supplies away from the walls where leaks were most likely. They brought in extra firewood and filled every container they had with water from the spring. The storm hit just after noon, and it was unlike anything Harold had experienced. Wind screamed through the trees with such force that branches broke and fell like rain. Thunder shook the cabin's foundation. Lightning struck so close they could smell ozone in the air. Rain came in horizontal sheets that found every crack and seam in the old structure. Harold and Margaret huddled by the fireplace, listening to the mountain's fury. Water began to drip through the tarp he had secured, forming puddles on the floor. The wind tore at the cabin walls, making the whole structure shudder. For the first time since arriving, Harold felt genuine fear. What if the cabin couldn't withstand this assault? What if they had been foolish to stay? But the cabin held. The old logs creaked and groaned, but they didn't break. The stone fireplace stood firm, its chimney drawing the smoke cleanly despite the wind. Even the damaged roof, though leaking, didn't collapse. When the storm finally passed, hours later, they emerged to assess the damage. Trees had fallen throughout the forest, some blocking the narrow road they had driven up. Branches littered the clearing. The garden plot Margaret had been so excited about was now a muddy mess. Yet something miraculous had happened. Where the garden had been churned by rain and wind, small green shoots were already emerging. Not weeds, but organized rows of growth that suggested seeds long dormant had finally found the conditions they needed to wake. Margaret knelt in the mud, gently touching the tender shoots. "These are vegetables," she said, her voice filled with awe. "Tomatoes, I think. And here, these look like bean plants. Harold, there were seeds in this soil waiting all these years." Harold helped her to her feet, and they stood together surveying the transformed garden. What had seemed dead was actually just sleeping, waiting for the right combination of water and care to bring it back to life. Over the following days, they fell into a rhythm. Harold worked on structural repairs, starting with the most urgent and gradually working his way down the list. He reinforced the porch supports, patched the roof as best he could with materials salvaged from fallen trees, and replaced broken window panes with plastic sheeting until he could get proper glass. Margaret focused on making the interior livable. She scrubbed years of grime from every surface, organized their meager supplies into some semblance of order, and began planning meals around what little food they had brought. She tended the miraculous garden daily, watching new growth emerge with each sunrise. They worked from dawn until dusk, falling into bed exhausted each night. Their hands developed calluses, their backs ached. Their muscles protested movements they hadn't made in years. But neither complained. The physical labor felt purifying somehow, as if they were sweating out the disappointment and hurt of the past months. A week passed, then two. Still no word from their children. Harold checked his phone occasionally when they drove down to the small town at the mountain's base for supplies. But the messages were all spam and automated notifications. Nothing personal. Nothing that mattered. At first, this silence stung, but gradually, it began to feel like freedom. They didn't have to perform for anyone, didn't have to pretend everything was fine, didn't have to make excuses for why they weren't a priority in their children's lives. They could simply be two people rebuilding something that had been broken. The garden continued to astonish them. Within 3 weeks, they had tomatoes ripening on the vine, beans climbing makeshift trellises Harold constructed from fallen branches, and lettuce forming tight heads in neat rows. Margaret harvested herbs she didn't remember planting, their fragrance filling the cabin when she hung them to dry. "We should have been farmers," she joked one evening, serving a salad made entirely from their garden. Harold smiled, chewing slowly. This tastes better than anything we bought at the grocery store. It was true. The vegetables had a vitality, a richness of flavor that seemed impossible. Margaret theorized it was the mineral content in the soil, fed by that underground spring. Harold didn't care about the why. He just knew that eating food they had grown themselves, in ground they had tended, felt profoundly right. The deer became regular visitors, appearing each morning and evening like clockwork. They grew comfortable enough to eat from Margaret's hand, taking apple cores and vegetable scraps with surprising gentleness. Other animals revealed themselves too. A fox that watched from the tree line, rabbits that hopped through the clearing at dusk, even a black bear that ambled past one afternoon, pausing to sniff the air before continuing its journey up the mountain. Harold and Margaret learned to read the mountain's moods. They could predict storms by the way the wind shifted. They knew when deer would visit by the quality of the light. They understood that certain bird calls meant rain was coming, while others signaled clear weather ahead. Their days took on a quality that neither could quite name. Not happiness exactly, because grief still lived in them, the grief of being forgotten by their own children, but something deeper than happiness, contentment, perhaps, or peace, the simple satisfaction of work done well, of needs met, of life lived in harmony with the rhythms around them. One morning, Margaret woke to find the first frost of autumn coating the clearing in silver. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, watching her breath cloud in the cold air, and realized she couldn't remember the last time she had thought about her phone, about emails, about any of the digital noise that had once filled her days. She turned to find Harold awake, watching her from their makeshift bed by the fireplace. "I think I'm happy here," she said, surprised by her own words. "Despite everything, I think I'm actually happy." Harold rose and joined her in the doorway, slipping his arm around her waist. "So am I." They stood together as the sun climbed higher, burning away the frost and revealing the vibrant colors of the garden beneath. The cabin that had seemed like a ruin now felt like a sanctuary. The mountain that had appeared forbidding now cradled them with gentle insistence. What they didn't know yet was that word of their transformation was beginning to spread in the small town below. The couple who had disappeared into the mountains, the elderly pair living in that old ruin, the garden that shouldn't exist, the spring that appeared from nowhere. People were starting to talk, and soon someone would come looking. But for now, in this perfect morning light, Harold and Margaret simply held each other and watched their paradise bloom. The stranger appeared on a Tuesday morning when fog still clung to the valley floor like cotton batting. Harold was splitting firewood behind the cabin when he heard the sound of an engine laboring up the mountain road. He set down his axe and watched as a battered pickup truck emerged from the mist. Its paint faded to a color that might once have been blue. The driver was a man in his 60s, weathered skin and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime working outdoors. He climbed out slowly, favoring his left leg, and removed a baseball cap before approaching. "Name's Thomas Webb," the man said, extending his hand. "I run the hardware store down in Pine Ridge. Heard you folks might need some supplies." Harold shook his hand, surprised by the visit. "We've been managing with what we can find." Thomas nodded toward the cabin. "That's what I heard. Also heard you've got the old Whitmore place looking better than it has in 40 years. Word travels fast," Harold observed. "In a 300-people town of everything travels fast." Thomas pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. "Made you a list of things you might need. Fair prices, no pressure. Just thought I'd offer." Margaret appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She studied Thomas with the careful assessment of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Thomas tipped his cap. "Ma'am, I know you don't know me from Adam, but my grandfather knew the original owner of this cabin. Said he was a good man who understood what this mountain could give to people who respected it." Something in Margaret's expression softened. "Would you like some coffee? That would be mighty kind." They sat at the table Harold had repaired, drinking coffee from mismatched mugs while Thomas told them about the town below. How the lumber mill had closed 15 years ago, taking most of the jobs with it. How young people left for cities and never came back. How houses stood empty and the school might close next year if enrollment didn't improve. But he also told them about the people who stayed. The widow who ran the post office and knew everyone's business. The retired teacher who organized a lending library from her living room. The mechanic who kept ancient vehicles running through sheer stubbornness and ingenuity. Folks help each other here, Thomas explained. That's how we survive. Someone needs a roof patched. People show up with hammers. Someone's short on groceries. Extra casseroles appear on their doorstep. No fanfare, no keeping score. Just neighbors being neighbors. Harold found himself drawn to this description of community, so different from the isolation they had experienced in their suburban neighborhood, where people barely knew each other's names. "Why are you really here?" Harold asked quietly. "You didn't drive up this mountain just to sell us hardware supplies." Thomas took a long sip of his coffee before answering. "Because people are talking about you two. About the garden that shouldn't be growing this time of year. About the spring that appeared out of nowhere. About how you've taken a place everyone thought was dead and brought it back to life." Margaret's hands tightened around her mug. "We're just trying to survive." "Maybe so," Thomas replied. "But survival looks different when you're doing it right. And people notice. Some of them are starting to wonder if maybe they gave up too easy on their own places, their own dreams." He stood to leave, placing money on the table for the coffee despite their protests. "Think about what I said. Town could use people who remember how to build instead of just watching things fall apart." After Thomas left, Harold and Margaret sat in silence, processing the conversation. They had come to the mountain to escape, to hide from the pain of abandonment, but somehow, without meaning to, they had become visible again. The following weeks brought more visitors. First came Elena Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s who taught at the elementary school. She had heard about Margaret's garden and wanted to know if she would consider teaching the children about growing food. "We have land behind the school," Elena explained, "but nobody knows what to do with it." Margaret found herself agreeing before she fully realized what she was committing to. The idea of working with children again, of passing on knowledge that might otherwise be lost, stirred something in her she thought had died when her own grandchildren became strangers. Then came Robert Chen, who owned the town's only restaurant. He had heard about the vegetables Margaret was growing and wondered if she might be interested in selling to him. "People around here are tired of produce that's been trucked in from 1,000 miles away," he said. "They want food that tastes like something." Harold built raised beds in the clearing, extending the garden's footprint. They planted winter crops, covering them with cold frames constructed from salvaged windows Thomas had delivered. The garden became a living laboratory, each bed an experiment in what could thrive in this particular soil, this specific climate. Word continued to spread. The couple on the mountain who had transformed a ruin into paradise, who had found water where there should be none, who grew vegetables that tasted like they remembered from childhood. People started making the drive up to see for themselves. They came with questions about soil composition, about seed saving, about building with salvaged materials. Harold and Margaret found themselves hosting impromptu workshops, sharing techniques they had learned through trial and error. But not everyone who came was friendly. One afternoon, a silver SUV pulled up, and a man in an expensive suit emerged. He introduced himself as Marcus Vance, a real estate developer from the city. He had heard about their property and wanted to make them an offer. "This whole area has potential," Marcus said, gesturing broadly at the surrounding forest. "People are looking for mountain retreats, vacation properties. I could offer you 3 times what this land is worth on paper." Harold crossed his arms. "It's not for sale." Marcus smiled the way people do when they're accustomed to getting what they want. "Everything's for sale at the right price. You're sitting on 5 acres of prime real estate. Think about what you could do with that money. Move somewhere easier, somewhere with medical facilities nearby, somewhere you wouldn't have to work so hard just to survive." Margaret appeared from the garden, dirt under her fingernails. her face flushed from exertion. "We like working hard," she said firmly. "And we like it here." Marcus shifted his attention to her. "I understand the appeal, really I do. But let's be practical. You're not getting any younger. What happens when one of you gets sick? When you can't maintain this place anymore? Wouldn't it be better to cash out now while you can?" Harold felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sharp. "You don't understand anything about this place." "I understand business," Marcus countered, "and I understand that land doesn't care about sentiment. This mountain will be here long after you're gone. Question is whether you want to profit from it, or just work yourselves to death trying to hold on to something that was never really yours to begin with." Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady and cold. "Our children said almost exactly the same thing, that we were being impractical, that we needed to think about our future, that holding on to things for sentimental reasons was foolish. You know what we discovered? That the things they called impractical were the only things that actually mattered." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Margaret wasn't finished. "We came here with nothing but each other and a deed to a falling down cabin. We found water where there shouldn't be water. We grew food where nothing should grow. We built something that people drive hours to see because it reminds them that transformation is possible. So no, Mr. Vance, our land is not for sale, not at any price, because some things are worth more than money, even if that's a language you don't speak." Marcus's smile faded. He handed Harold a business card. "When you change your mind, give me a call. Everyone changes their mind eventually." After he left, Margaret's hands were shaking. Harold pulled her close, feeling the tremor of anger and fear running through her. "Do you think we're being foolish?" she asked quietly. "Maybe he's right. Maybe we're just two old people playing house in the woods." Harold held her tighter. "Look around. Look at what we've built. Look at the people who've started coming here, who've started believing they can build something too. That's not foolish. That's the opposite of foolish." That night, they lay awake listening to the mountain sounds that had become so familiar. The creek's constant murmur, the wind moving through pine branches, an owl calling from somewhere in the darkness. Margaret spoke into the quiet. "I think we should write to the children." Harold turned to look at her, surprised. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Not to ask them for anything, not to make them feel guilty, just to tell them we're okay, that we found something here we didn't know we were looking for. Maybe they need to know their parents didn't just disappear into sadness." So Harold wrote the letter by lamplight, his handwriting careful and deliberate. He told them about the cabin and the garden, about the spring and the deer, about the community that had welcomed them. He didn't mention feeling abandoned. He didn't ask why they never called. He simply shared the story of their transformation, hoping it might plant a seed of curiosity or connection. He addressed the letter to their eldest daughter, knowing she would share it with her siblings if she chose. Then he added a final line. "If you ever want to visit, you know where to find us. The door is always open." They mailed the letter the next time they went to town, and then they tried not to think about it too much. Hoping felt dangerous after so much disappointment. Meanwhile, the garden continued to thrive in ways that defied explanation. Margaret harvested vegetables well into November, long after frost should have killed everything. The spring beneath the cabin ran stronger as winter approached. Its water so cold and pure, it made their teeth ache. And the deer kept coming, morning and evening, like clockwork. Margaret had named them Grace and Gabriel, though Harold teased her about getting too attached to wild animals. But there was something about their presence that felt intentional, protective even. One morning in early December, Harold woke to find fresh snow covering the clearing. Not the heavy, wet snow that bent branches and made work difficult, but a light dusting that transformed everything into something ethereal and beautiful. Margaret stood at the window, watching the sun rise over the white landscape. Her reflection in the glass showed something Harold hadn't seen in years. Not just contentment, but joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. "We should make Christmas here," she said suddenly. "Really make it. The way we used to before everything got so complicated. Harold joined her at the window. What did you have in mind? She turned to face him, eyes bright. Let's invite people. Thomas and Elena and Robert. Anyone from town who doesn't have somewhere to be. Let's fill this place with life and food and warmth. Let's show people what this cabin has become. So they spent the next weeks preparing. Harold cut a small pine tree from their property and dragged it inside. Margaret made decorations from natural materials, pine cones and berries and branches twisted into wreaths. They baked bread and cookies, filling the cabin with smells that spoke of comfort and celebration. Word spread through town about the Christmas gathering at the old Whitmore place. People who had been curious but hesitant found themselves drawn to the idea. A celebration not of wealth or status, but of survival and community, and the simple miracle of finding home in unexpected places. On Christmas Eve, they came. More than 20 people made the drive up the mountain, bringing food and stories and gratitude for the invitation. The cabin that had stood empty for so long now overflowed with voices and laughter. Thomas brought his guitar and played carols. Elena's children ran through the snow, their shrieks of delight echoing through the trees. Robert contributed dishes from his restaurant, flavors from his childhood in Taiwan that he rarely had occasion to make anymore. Harold stood outside for a moment, watching through the windows as Margaret moved among their guests, her face glowing in the firelight. This was what home was supposed to feel like. Not perfect, not without sadness, but full of people who had chosen to show up, who had chosen to be present, who had chosen connection over convenience. When he went back inside, Elena approached him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "My kids haven't been this happy since their father died. They needed to remember what joy feels like." Harold didn't know what to say, so he just hugged her. This woman who had been a stranger 3 months ago, and now felt like family. As midnight approached and guests began to leave, promising to return soon, Harold and Margaret stood on the porch, watching taillights disappear down the mountain. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady. Margaret leaned against Harold's shoulder. "Do you think they'll ever come? Our children?" Harold wrapped his arm around her. "I don't know, but I know we'll be okay either way. We have this place. We have each other. We have people who chose us." She nodded, and they stood together in the falling snow. Two people who had been abandoned and who had responded by building something worth finding. What they didn't know was that their eldest daughter had received the letter, had read it 3 times, had cried, had shown it to her siblings, had started planning a trip she didn't know how to explain to her own family. But that revelation was still weeks away, waiting like a seed beneath winter snow, ready to emerge when conditions were finally right. The daughter's name was Claire, and she sat in her downtown office staring at her father's letter for what must have been the 20th time that week. The paper had grown soft from handling, the creases deep from being folded and unfolded, read and reread in stolen moments between conference calls and client meetings. She had built a life that looked successful from every angle. Corner office with a view of the city skyline. Salary that would have seemed impossible to her younger self. Respect from colleagues who valued her sharp mind and sharper instincts. But sitting there with her father's words in her hands, Claire felt something crack open inside her chest. The letter didn't accuse, it didn't guilt. It simply told a story about 2 people who had found a way to keep living when everyone assumed they would just fade away quietly. Her father's handwriting was still precise, still careful. Each letter formed with the same attention to detail he had brought to everything in his life. But there was something different in the words themselves, a lightness she hadn't heard from him in years. Claire picked up her phone and called her brother Michael. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice harried and distracted, the way it always was lately. "Did you read it?" she asked without preamble. Michael was quiet for a moment. "Yeah, I read it. What are we supposed to do with this?" Her brother sighed, and she could picture him running his hand through his hair, the way he did when life pressed too hard. I don't know, Claire. Part of me wants to drive up there right now. Part of me is angry they just disappeared without telling anyone. Part of me feels like maybe we don't deserve to show up now after everything. After everything we didn't do, Claire corrected quietly. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the phone calls they hadn't made, all the visits they had been too busy for, all the ways they had let their parents become background noise in their urgent, important lives. I'm going to go see them, Claire said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. After New Year's, I'm going to take a week and drive up there and see this place for myself. Do you want company? Michael asked. Maybe. Let me go first. I need to understand what happened before I bring everyone else into it. Claire hung up and stared out her window at the city below. Thousands of people moving through their days, all of them carrying their own versions of guilt and regret and complicated family histories. She had spent so many years convincing herself that success meant distance, that growing up meant growing away, that becoming someone important required leaving certain people and places behind. But her father's letter suggested something different, that maybe real success looked like finding the courage to start over when everything fell apart, that maybe importance had nothing to do with corner offices and everything to do with who showed up when life got hard. The weeks between Christmas and New Year's passed in a blur of finalizing projects and tying up loose ends. Claire told her assistant she would be unreachable for a week in January, citing personal family matters. Her boss raised an eyebrow but approved the time off. She had earned it, after all. She always earned it. That was the problem. On the second day of January, Claire loaded her car with supplies she thought her parents might need. Warm blankets and good coffee, books and magazines. A new smartphone with unlimited data, because surely they would need better connection to the outside world. As she drove north out of the city, watching buildings give way to suburbs and then to open land, she realized she had no idea what she would actually find when she arrived. The drive took most of the day. Her GPS worked until it didn't, losing signal somewhere in the foothills where cell towers became sparse and roads narrowed to 2 lanes. She followed her father's written directions, landmarks described in his careful handwriting, past the general store with the faded Coca-Cola sign, left at the fork where the oak tree split into 3 trunks, up the mountain road that turned from pavement to gravel to dirt. When she finally saw the cabin through the trees, Claire had to pull over and just sit for a moment. This couldn't be the ruin her father had described. The structure before her looked solid, well-maintained, almost welcoming. Smoke rose from the chimney. Light glowed in the windows against the gathering dusk. A garden lay dormant under winter snow, but even in its sleeping state, she could see the careful organization, the thoughtful planning. She sat in her car watching the cabin, and something about the scene made her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't quite name. Not grief exactly, though grief lived in it. Not regret, though that too was present. Something closer to recognition. Like seeing a photograph of yourself from long ago and remembering who you used to be before life taught you to be someone else. Claire was still sitting there when the door opened and her mother stepped onto the porch. Margaret froze, one hand still on the doorframe, staring at the car she didn't recognize. Then Claire opened her door and stood, and her mother's hand flew to her mouth. "Mom," Claire called across the clearing. "I got your letter." Margaret didn't move. She just stood there on the porch, and Claire could see her mother's chest rising and falling with breath that came too fast, too shallow. Then Harold appeared behind her, and his face went through a series of expressions so quickly Claire couldn't track them all. Shock, joy, fear, hope, something that looked like pain. Claire started walking toward the cabin, her feet crunching through snow that sparkled in the last light of day. She had rehearsed what she would say during the long drive, prepared speeches about being sorry, about understanding now what she hadn't understood before, about wanting to rebuild what had been broken. But standing there in front of her parents, all those careful words evaporated. "I should have come sooner," was all she managed. Margaret came down the porch steps slowly, as if approaching something fragile that might bolt if startled. When she reached Claire, she stopped just an arm's length away, studying her daughter's face with an intensity that made Claire feel exposed. "You look tired," Margaret said finally. Claire laughed, a sound caught between humor and tears. "I am tired. I've been tired for years, I think. I just didn't know it until I read Dad's letter." Harold joined them, moving with a carefulness that spoke of old injuries and new strength. He looked different somehow. Not younger exactly, but more present, more solid, like he had returned to himself after a long absence. "The cabin's not much," he said, his voice gruff with emotion he was trying to control. "But you're welcome to stay as long as you want." Claire looked past him to the structure that had somehow become home to her parents. "Not much," he said, but she could see the care in every detail. The rebuilt porch, the repaired roof, the windows that gleamed even in fading light. This was more than not much. This was evidence of transformation, of survival, of two people who had refused to accept the ending everyone else had written for them. "I'd like that," Claire said, "if you'll have me." Margaret reached out and took her daughter's hand. Her grip was strong, strengthened by months of physical labor and purpose. "Come inside. You must be hungry from the drive." The interior of the cabin stopped Claire in her tracks. Where she had expected rustic poverty, she found warmth and order and a kind of simple beauty that spoke of intentional choices. The fire in the stone hearth cast dancing light across walls that had been cleaned and repaired. Furniture that looked handmade stood arranged for both function and comfort. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with scents that reminded Claire of her grandmother's kitchen from childhood. "You did all this?" she asked, turning slowly to take it all in. "We had help," Harold said, moving to add wood to the fire. "People from town. They've been generous with time and knowledge." Margaret was already at the small stove, heating soup she had made that morning. Claire spaced with practiced efficiency and watched her mother move through the compact something about the scene made her chest ache. When had she last seen her mother look so purposeful, so engaged with the simple acts of daily living? They ate at the wooden table, and Claire found herself telling them about her life in ways she never had before. Not the polished version she presented at family gatherings, all accomplishments and forward momentum, but the truth beneath, the loneliness of success that felt increasingly hollow. The relationships she had sacrificed for career advancement, the growing sense that she had optimized her life right past anything that actually mattered. Harold and Margaret listened without judgment, without the advice-giving that had always made Claire defensive in the past. They just listened, and their listening created space for Claire to hear herself speak truths she had been avoiding. When darkness fully claimed the mountain, Margaret lit oil lamps that cast softer light than electricity ever could. They sat by the fire, and Claire asked the questions she had driven 8 hours to ask. Why here? Why this cabin? Why disappear without warning? Her father answered slowly, choosing his words with care. Because we needed to remember who we were before we became people who could be forgotten. Because sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what you're actually made of. Because this place asked something of us that nothing else had in years. It asked us to show up, to be present, to matter. Margaret added her own truth. Your father and I spent so many years being useful to other people. Useful to you children, useful to employers and communities and causes. But somewhere along the way, we stopped being necessary. We became optional, and optional people are easy to forget. Claire felt those words like a physical blow. I didn't forget you. I was just busy. Margaret's smile was sad, but not unkind. Everyone's busy, honey. Busy is a choice we make about what deserves our time. And the truth is, your father and I were teaching you to choose other things. We taught you that work came first, that success meant sacrifice, that being needed by important people was more valuable than being wanted by family. But we were wrong, Harold continued. What we found here is that necessity looks different than we thought. These people in town, they don't need us because we're successful or impressive. They need us because we showed up and we're willing to help, and we remember that community means choosing each other even when it's inconvenient. They talked late into the night, and Claire listened to stories about the garden and the spring and the neighbors who had become family, about the developer who wanted to buy the land and the Christmas gathering that had filled the cabin with strangers who became friends, about learning to read the mountain's moods and trusting that deer would appear each morning like clockwork. As midnight approached, Margaret showed Claire to the small loft space they had prepared as a guest room. The mattress was thin, the space cramped, but blankets were warm, and the window framed a view of stars so thick and bright they looked close enough to touch. Claire woke before dawn to the sound of her mother moving quietly below. Through the loft window, the first light touched the mountain peaks, painting them gold and rose. She lay there for a moment, wrapped in borrowed blankets, listening to the simple sounds of her parents beginning another day in the life they had built from ruins. When she descended the ladder, she found them at the window watching Grace and Gabriel arrive for their morning visit. The deer moved through the clearing with unhurried grace, and her parents stood together the way people do who have learned to be grateful for small miracles. Margaret turned and smiled. "Coffee's ready." Over the following days, Claire helped with the work that kept the cabin running. She split firewood alongside her father, her soft office hands blistering and then hardening. She learned to tend the winter garden with her mother, understanding for the first time the patience required to coax life from frozen ground. She met the neighbors who had become family, saw how community could be built through showing up rather than just showing off. On her last morning before returning to the city, Claire stood